So let's begin this talk. When you see a talk like this and you see the diverse group of schools, you wonder, why isn't your school on that list? And maybe it will be in the future as you learn about this. But basically, we have Rohit, Thomas, and Erin Griesenauer going to talk about general framework for incorporating ethical reasoning into mathematical modeling. So we turn it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you to the organizers for giving us an opportunity to present our work. And thank you all for being here on a Sunday evening for me, maybe earlier for you all, but to hear about it. So like he mentioned, our work is not just from, my work and Rohit. It's a whole group of us who have been working on this framework together. From many different states across the United States, many different time zones. But this is what we've developed, and some of us have started using it in our classes. Let's see. Perfect. Okay, so here is an outline of what we're going to talk about. So the first thing we want to address is, what do we mean by ethical reasoning, and what don't we mean by ethical reasoning? We want to talk about our motivation. So why do we think it's important to include ethical reasoning when we talk about mathematical modeling? And then we'll talk about the goals of our framework and how it was designed. And I'll give a general description of our framework. And then we'll look at how this framework has been applied to a specific problem. With that, we'll have some student feedback, so some examples of student answers to the questions, but also feedback on how students felt about being asked to think about ethical reasoning in a math class. We also have some instructor reflections on the process, and then we'll end with some future work that we plan on doing and acknowledgements about what brought us all together. Okay, so our idea here is that we want to develop a framework where we can add ethical reasoning questions to an existing mathematical modeling activity or problem. So what do we mean by ethical reasoning? Ethical reasoning is a multi-step process that begins with recognizing ethical issues that are inherent in the mathematical modeling and its context. Then thinking through ways of resolving these issues using multiple perspectives, ultimately making an ethical decision, implementing that decision, and reflecting on the outcome. So when we say that we should be teaching ethical reasoning in math, we are not saying that you should be teaching ethics. Certainly, we are not, philosophers or experts in ethics, but we all experience ethical reasoning, so we can all talk about it. We're not thinking that we should be teaching some specific standards or professional code. Many professional organizations have a code of ethics, but we're thinking about something more general than that. We're not teaching morality or a specific set of values. And we're not saying that we should only be addressing questions that are ethical, in its heart. We think that this is something that can be applied to all sorts of models, not just models that maybe address social justice issues. Okay, so why do we think that we should be doing this? Maybe as a starting place, a good question is, why not? Ethical reasoning is a fundamental part of mathematical modeling because mathematical models aim to answer real-life problems with real-life consequences. So if we're trying to model something that's happening in real life, we should be considering the context in which it's happening and thinking about that. In fact, we have this quote, and I agree with it, that as mathematics teachers, if we're not considering the ethical reasoning that's inherent in mathematical modeling, we really aren't doing all of our jobs. We're not being ethical math teachers if we don't discuss the ethical components of building a mathematical model. So here are some more reasons why. Students' career trajectories will often involve using mathematics in applications in a variety of fields, right? So our students could go on and work in financial fields where they're doing analysis of economics. They could be working as engineers. They could be working as scientists investigating climate change. They're going into a lot of different places, not always working as mathematicians, but often involving real world situations. And in those situations, we would like them to be making ethical decisions. So if they're not getting the practice making those ethical decisions in our class, where will they? We want them to be prepared to think about ethical reasoning when they go out into their future jobs. And this, our framework is meant to be included, all along the way. So not just in upper level math classes, but beginning in early classes, because we would really like even majors who are not math majors, but are taking our service classes to be thinking about the ethical components of mathematics. Let's see, as a bonus, one thing we've noticed is that it helps with teaching math. It makes the math more relevant to the students. It engages them in a different way, gives them a different way of making sense of the math and connecting to it. So it can help motivate our students, especially in those service classes where maybe they don't want to be there. It also helps with teaching critical thinking, which is something that probably all of our universities value. It's central to a lot of our mission statements to teach critical thinking, and ethical reasoning is an important part of that. Okay, so we chose to build a framework that could be applied in lots of different places, and here's our thinking on that. We wanted a framework that would be course independent, that you could incorporate into any class that has mathematical modeling examples in it. So even, I taught pre-calculus last semester. Even in pre-calculus, we do some modeling and we could talk about the ethical reasoning, through Calc 1 and Calc 2, differential equations, and up into the upper level math classes. We would like this to be something that we include throughout the students' time. We wanted something that would be easy to use because all of us are very busy. Teaching is a lot of work. So we wanted something that wouldn't require a lot of extra work to bring into a class. And part of the reason why it's easy to use is because it doesn't require you to create new content. Our framework takes an existing mathematical modeling activity and builds ethical reasoning into it. So we aren't coming up with any new models. We're just using the ones we already use. And then, like I mentioned, this is something where we'd like to have it implemented across classes so that we can build consistency. And you can use it in a lot of different ways in your classes so that you're using it throughout the semester also, so that we're creating a routine. Our students are getting used to answering these types of questions and are starting to expect it. And we can really build that pattern of thought where ethical reasoning is considered as they approach a math problem. Okay, so here's a brief description of our framework. Again, the idea is that we want to add ethical reasoning questions to an existing mathematical modeling activity or problem. And we view mathematical modeling problems as three groups of tasks, 3 stages. So the first stage is always understanding the background in which the model will be used and the context in which it will be used. This could include gathering background information, maybe gathering the data, and addressing what types of questions you're going to want to answer with your model. The second stage is what we usually address in our mathematical modeling activities, which is the mathematical solution of the model. So describing it as a mathematical model and solving it using mathematical techniques. And then the third stage is a reflection stage where we evaluate the results. We think about whether they're valid or not, and who might be impacted by them. And we think that these are the 3 big stages anytime you use a mathematical modeling, but we've noticed that most of our classes, when we teach mathematical modeling, we're just focused on that second step. So our framework is really about building out the first and third steps. We think that's where the ethical reasoning is happening, and sort of getting our students to start thinking about the first and third steps instead of just the middle one.
So here's an example of a modeling problem that one of us used in a course this past fall. It's a pretty standard mathematical modeling problem. We're given some data on In this case, population of an endangered species, what you might call the mathematical analysis part. Students are asked to make plots of the data on various scales, use the plots to find the functional relationship between this endangered bird population and time. So this is what the students usually think of as the math. We want to encourage students to start thinking about the context as they think about the mathematical analysis, think about the ethical parts of this problem as being just as important as the math. So here are some background kinds of questions that we've asked to go along with this question about modeling endangered bird populations. How would you test the accuracy of this model? Ask students to think about whether this model is reliable over short intervals, or might the growth rate of the population not be constant? Are there challenges in estimating the population numbers? How confident are we in our predictions of populations in the future? These are all kind of background questions that we could build into the problem, either before they do the mathematical analysis or after, to think about just the model and its context. We also have a series of questions that focus on ethical reasoning that are part of reflecting on the model as a whole. This question is about estimating populations of an endangered species over time. So it's worth it for students to think about who might care about this model. What are some business groups or industry groups or nonprofit or government organizations that might use this model? And why might they be using this model? What question might they be trying to answer? For those groups that are thinking about using a model for an endangered species population, what are the consequences if this model is inaccurate? What persons or groups or things or entities might be affected? What kinds of policy decisions might these groups make using the results? Who would those policy decisions affect? If we're overestimating or underestimating a population, which is better? Which overestimates or underestimates risks? What other questions could we ask? So as a whole, the goal here is asking students to think about, okay, you're modeling a population over time, but put that into a real world context. Who would care? Why would they care? Sometimes this is called a stakeholder analysis. We've chosen not to use the term stakeholder, but an analysis of who's impacted, who's affected by the decisions that might be made using this model. Just getting students to practice thinking whenever they do a mathematical analysis, get students to practice thinking, okay, who would this affect and why? And what does our math have to do with who is affected and why? So here's an example of a real student's response to this question. The question, who might be interested in the predictions of crane populations and why? And what would be the consequences if the predictions were too high or too low? One student said, wildlife protection organizations, conservationists, animal enthusiasts, and so on, people who care about animals could be interested in these predictions. If the predictions were too high, if the predicted populations were higher than the actual populations, then conservationists would be overestimating the populations and we wouldn't be spending enough on protecting this endangered species. If our predictions were too low, if the predicted population was lower than the actual population, then perhaps we'd be spending too many resources on preserving cranes when we should be spending them on another more endangered animal. So in the previous couple slides, we showed here's a whole bunch of different questions you might ask that could be added to a modeling problem. Perhaps an easier way to do that If you have time, you can take a modeling problem and build out a whole bunch of specific questions that relate. But an easier version is just to, anytime you have a mathematical problem, ask students to consider the context, or if the problem comes without a real world context, ask students to consider a context of their choice. Ask them what assumptions are being made. How do we verify the reasonableness of those assumptions? List some people or entities that might be affected positively or negatively by these assumptions. This is a pretty straightforward question, or part or series of questions, that we suggest you can add to any mathematical modeling problem. In one recent calculus course, where the students were given ethical reasoning questions every week, students were surveyed at the beginning and end of the quarter. Almost all students, 94% of students, agreed that they were prepared to think about who their decisions would affect and how. Now, many of those students, about 3/5 of those students, felt like they already agreed with that statement at the beginning of the course, but a full third of those students felt like at the beginning of the course versus the end of the course, taking this course involving weekly ethical reasoning problems, at the end of that course, they agreed more with this statement that they're prepared to think about who their decisions will affect than they did at the beginning of the course. Now, of course, we can't separate out everything. This is one college course. They're also taking other college courses and growing as people. So we can't be sure that this one course was the only thing that affected their ethical reasoning capabilities. But this is certainly promising data. Similarly, not only do they agree that they are prepared to think about who their decisions will affect and how, but they agree that it'll be important for them to think about who their decisions will affect and how. The numbers here were almost exactly the same. Almost every student agreed that ethical reasoning was an important skill. 60% of them already agreed before they took this course, but a good third of them, after taking this course, they agreed more than before. So we see, after taking a single course where they have consistent weekly ethical reasoning questions, we have some improvement in students' self-reported ethical reasoning skills and self-reported perception of the importance of ethical reasoning. We also have some thoughts from instructors who have used this framework, where we just use this simpler model, just throughout the course, adding this question of who would your decisions affect and how, and what are the assumptions and how reasonable are they? Throughout the course, students were more interested in the mathematical problems. Students engaged more with the problems that had an ethical component, although the problems that had an ethical component also had more real life context. So it's not clear if it's ethical reasoning or just being applied that drove student interest. Most students indicated that this course was the first time they had any ethical reasoning experience in a math course. They'd never thought about ethical reasoning in a math course, which maybe isn't so surprising given the way we were all educated. Over time, students did get better at their ethical reasoning skills. They deepened their analysis over time of what kind of parties would be affected. The first couple of times that we run these kinds of questions, students often think about businesses or corporations, and sometimes it can be tricky to get them to think, for example, that, well, animals or nature can also be affected by our decisions and they're worth taking into account. But after the first couple times that we do these questions, students don't really need much nudging to start getting into the habit of thinking creatively about who their decisions will affect. Finally, in a situation where students took one calculus course involving ethical reasoning questions and then a second course also involving ethical reasoning questions, There's significant improvement in those students who did this for 2 semesters in a row. In the future, we'd like to continue disseminating this framework to the larger mathematics community. If there's only a couple of us using this framework for ethical reasoning in the classroom, it's not so helpful, but the more instructors start to use this, and we hope the more students start to learn this, we think the better that is for the general mathematics community in the world. We'd also like to eventually include broader ethical reasoning dimensions. For example, it would be great if we could get students to start to consider multiple perspectives, to consider diverse perspectives when they're thinking about the ethical implications of their mathematical modeling. Think from the perspective of this group, from the perspective of that group. Get them to start thinking about how their actions impact others and how their actions are perceived by others. We'd like to thank Catherine Buell, Victor Piercy, and Rochelle Trachtenberg for organizing the MAA workshop in framing mathematics as a foundation for ethical STEM. This is a workshop we participated in this past summer, which is what brought us together and got us working on this, as well as our fellow workshop participants. Thank you all for attending. Thank you to the conference organizers once again for the invitation. And of course, we recognize our NSF funding sponsors. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Let's be sure we say thank you first, okay? And then let's ask if there are any questions or comments. Just speak up if you have. How big a community do you think this is?
Community of instructors using ethical reasoning.
Yeah, people who are willing to say, I'm going to invest in this, because it takes energy, it takes fear of, well, I can't cover the topics, you know, the usual stuff. But I mean, and what gets them over the hump of saying, I'll go for it? So first, how many do you think, you know, do we have a sense of what other people are doing around the country, or only from the workshop you had? Or
we don't know of anybody else who is using this idea. However, our goal in developing this framework was to make it easy for any instructor to just start adopting these practices. The idea is you don't really have to spend any class time going over these ideas. Just add to a homework assignment or a weekly project or any kind of activity, add a short question. Think about this, and give them feedback on what they write. And throughout a semester of asking them these type of questions regularly, that's all it takes for students to start getting better at thinking about ethical reasoning, reasoning ethically in a regular manner.
okay, so I'm going to put on my editor hat. As founder of Primus, the journal 30 years ago, I would go to conferences and stalk talks like yours, and I would come out and say, you need to write an article about this. And then you would say, well, I don't know if I can write an article. And then I would say, you have the article here. It's called a PowerPoint. What you need is verbs. So I'm here to tell you that the current editor, Matt Bulkins of Primus, and there are other journals, and I don't know how far you are along this, who would love to have an article, at least one. And then there's a special issues editor. So in 5 years or less, you go back and you say, not only did you like our article, we'd like to do a special issue on these ethical considerations. People need to hear about it. And we really appreciate your coming to share it right now. And we know that you're willing to correspond with people and help spread the word. And so in that sense, what you're offering is very valuable. I think you ought to know that, and it's not only appreciated. And one other thing is that, you know, let's talk about how far beyond the course you might go. Let's talk about the spread of MRIs. So an MRI machine costs a fortune, over $100,000, and no rural hospital, or I shouldn't say this, not every rural hospital needs an MRI. In fact, the funds to go into an MRI could be more wisely used perhaps for other things than a small rural hospital. What I just said is ethical considerations. Plotting the data on the spread of MRIs in the United States, in Africa, in Europe, is mathematics. And so getting the kids to think about, this isn't just about how many there are, it's like, do we need that many or do we need more? So I think every data fitting project you have probably has an add-on that you could, bring that to it. And I guess, what resources can you share with us again that we could see how to do more specifics? Because what Rohit showed us first sort of piqued my interest, well, I could do that. Do you have others or resources or papers? Erin, I can't hear.
Right now, we're all sort of developing our own,
That's
based
great.
on the examples that we use in our classes, we're building these questions into them. We are writing a paper currently for Primus
Oh, good.
to
Okay.
outline our framework in more detail that we hope to submit, sometime soon. Yeah, and we've talked as a group about ways of making our specific course material more available, and haven't really figured out the right way of organizing that. But it is on our minds, and I think that, I guess there was also a question in the chat about having grab and go materials. Right now, the best we can do for grab and go is that sort of simplified questions, which you really can ask about any modeling question. You can always ask what assumptions are being made, are they valid, and who's going to be impacted for any model that you use.
One other suggestion is, it's too late for MathFest, but for JMM next year, try to get a special session. Now, one of two things can happen. You can find out people coming out of the woodwork who are doing this stuff and you didn't even know. And the other thing is nothing happens, right? In other words, either they go, well, I'm not ready to talk about it, or they never even thought about it. But, jump on that. It doesn't take much to get a permission for, I shouldn't say that, but I mean, it's easy to write up a proposal to get a special session at JMM. And I think they would grab this. You usually have to point to a number of people who you might think talk, and you might have a little difficulty, but there's time here. So you're doing great stuff, and you're trying to get the word out for the rest of us with examples, which I suspect an article would be rich in, because that's how people latch on. They go, ethics. Oh, wow, that's just totally, ethics and ether are right up there at about the same vocabulary for some people. But I really commend you for working on this, working on an article. And what's the joy in your classrooms like? Can you feel it? Can you, your data said that students became more aware and more willing to consider these things, but does it happen in the classroom as well?
Yes, absolutely. Students are more engaged when they're working on these problems. And to relate to this, one of the questions in the chat was about, do we spend time discussing these ethical implications with the students when we're doing these examples? And it really varies by instructor. Some instructors have a lot more discussion in their classroom and go over some of these examples and talk through it. In a huge lecture course with 200 or 300 students, one may not want to do that, but then one can still give these problems in written assignments that students do in groups perhaps, and then give them written feedback. Really, there's room for you to adopt this as an instructor to your style.
Yeah, I'm thinking that someone was talking about putting in a limerick or jokes or something at the start of class or playing music. If you did something in a lesson the day before, you could put up an ethical issue on the board before class even starts. As the students walk in the room, you say, "I'd like you to talk to your neighbor about this," and then open up the class and say, "What did you find?" I mean, it sounds very rich, and I've got to go because I've got to get to the next session, but we'll leave this open and keep talking if you want. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you, everybody.
Okay.
See, Rachel, you've had your hand up.
So I have a comment that actually something like this is actually what drew me at one of the day MMs to get in, to continue kind of keeping in touch with Semioid, because my question then is one that I still am looking at different ways, which is, and it got started because at the time I was working at St. Philip's College in San Antonio, and there was 3 of us that, you know, our supervisor always wanted us, we had to take a 10-minute break from the lab every 2 hours. We were required to. And there was 3 of us that, because the way the shifts were, that he always wanted us to go together and then return together. And he would always be on our case because there was only one wheelchair accessible stall and all 3 of us happened to need it. And it was not that only, and I, you know, this got to be this big issue. I went to the, you know, the trustees of the district and everything, and had this conversation many times over the years, is that because if they have 8 restrooms, they only have to have 1 that's wheelchair accessible. Every new restroom and every renovation in the building and every new building has exactly 8 stalls in every restroom. Because if they have a 9th one, they have to have another one that's accessible. But so then I started trying to look at, prove to my boss that, okay, this is the district's problem. It's the school's problem because you are the ones wasting the efficiency of the employees, and starting looking. But unfortunately, you know, this is where you have to use math because people aren't using, you know, they're using the plain numbers as their, for making decisions, and they're not including ethical reasoning. So it's kind of funny. I'm on like the opposite side saying, okay, you're not using the ethical reasoning here. Just think maybe everyone should just have equal access to the restroom. And it's, you know, and the cleaning people, they take their carts in there. So then, you know, a lot of students have huge backpacks, and so everyone wants that one stall.
Right.
And, you know, I'll go into the restroom and here's, you know, these other stalls all empty and everyone's waiting in line for the one because they want to take their backpack with them or whatever. And so I just had that comment that this is really at the heart of what got me involved in this group to begin with, is to think of, take the people in the general public and the people who are the decision makers who are making their decisions only based on the actual just sheer quantitative analysis, and saying, hey, let's put some ethics back into this. But if you're going to only go with quantitative, I can prove it to you on quantitative too. You're wasting your employees' time, you know?
Right.
So thank you so much for having this session. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.